Rick Collins looked up at the clear blue sky and smiled. It was a perfect day for the Veterans Day Parade. He had been waiting for this event for months. As a former Marine who had lost the use of his legs during his service in Afghanistan, Rick felt a special connection to days like this. They reminded him that his sacrifice meant something. His wife Diane squeezed his shoulder gently as she pulled their old Ford into the drop-off zone near the entrance to the event grounds. "You sure you don't want me to stay with you until I find parking?" she asked, concern in her eyes. Rick shook his head. "I'll be fine. You know how packed it gets. Better grab a spot while you can." He patted her hand. "I'll meet you at our usual spot near the main stage." Diane nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. "I'll text you when I'm inside. Should be about 20 minutes. After helping Rick into his wheelchair, Diane kissed him goodbye and drove off to find parking. Rick adjusted his Marine cork cap and began wheeling himself toward the entrance. He wore his service medals proudly on his jacket. Each one told a story, stories of courage, loss, and brotherhood that civilians could never fully understand. The late morning sun felt good on his face. Rick had spent too many days indoors lately. His physical therapy sessions had been more painful than usual this month, and the doctors were concerned about potential complications with his spine. But today, none of that mattered. Today was about remembering and honoring service. As Rick approached the main entrance, he noticed the growing crowd. Hundreds of people were already lined up at the security checkpoints, families with small children waving miniature American flags, elderly veterans sporting caps from various wars, and civilians who simply came to show support. It was a heartwarming sight. Rick spotted the sign for accessible entry and directed his wheelchair toward it. The event organizers had promised improved accessibility this year, but as he got closer, Rick frowned. The wheelchair access point was partially blocked by stacks of metal barriers and a table with scanning equipment. Two security guards in black uniforms stood nearby. Their jackets had Sentinel Security Services emblazoned on the back in bold yellow letters. The older guard was busy checking a family's bags, while the younger one seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone. Rick cleared his throat as he approached. "Excuse me, is this the accessible entrance?" The younger guard, whose name tag read Simmons, looked up with obvious annoyance. He was in his early 20s with close-cropped hair and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. "Yeah, but you need to wait." "We're busy," Simmons said, not making eye contact. Rick glanced at the equipment blocking the path. "I understand you're busy, but could you please move that table so I can get through? That's why there's an accessible entrance, right?" Simmons sighed loudly. "Just go around to the main line." "The main line isn't wheelchair accessible," Rick explained patiently. "There are steps." By now, a small group of people had gathered behind Rick, also waiting to use the accessible entrance. An elderly woman with a walker and a family with a child in a specialized stroller shifted uncomfortably as the conversation continued. "Sir, I'm a veteran," Rick added. "I just want to attend the parade like everyone else." Simmons finally looked at Rick, his eyes flicking dismissively over the medals on his jacket. "Everyone's in a hurry, just wait your turn." The older security guard finally noticed the situation and approached. His name tag identified him as Murphy. "What's the problem here?" Murphy asked. "The accessible entrance is blocked," Rick explained. Again. "I'm just asking if someone could move that equipment so people in wheelchairs can get through." Murphy seemed more reasonable. "Frank, move that table so these folks can get in," he instructed Simmons. Simmons rolled his eyes but didn't move. "We were told not to touch the scanning equipment once it's set up. Besides, there's space, he's just being picky." Rick felt his patience wearing thin. The sun that had felt pleasant earlier now beat down mercilessly, and he could feel sweat gathering under his collar. Behind him, the elderly woman with the walker was beginning to look distressed in the heat. "Look," Rick said firmly. "There are people behind me who also need this entrance. Could you please just move the table a few feet?" Simmons stepped closer, to Rick invading his personal space. Listen, buddy, I don't care if you're a veteran or the president. You don't tell me how to do my job. Several bystanders gasped at the guard's tone. A man in the crowd called out, "Hey, show some respect. The man served our country." Murphy put a hand on his colleague's shoulder. Frank just moved the damn table. But Simmons had reached his breaking point. With a sudden movement that caught everyone by surprise, he grabbed the handles of Rick's wheelchair. "You want to get through so badly? Fine." With a forceful shove, Simmons pushed Rick's wheelchair to the side. What the security guard failed to notice was that they were positioned at the top of a slight incline that led down toward the street. The wheelchair's wheels began to roll, picking up speed quickly. Rick grabbed at his wheels, trying to stop the momentum, but the incline was too steep and his hands slipped on the metal. People screamed as his wheelchair rolled past the curb and into the busy street. Cars honked and swerved. A yellow taxicab screeched to a halt just inches from Rick's chair, the driver's face a mask of shock behind the windshield. The smell of burnt rubber filled the air. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Rick sat in the middle of the traffic lane, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, like a broken dam, people rushed forward. A woman in scrubs, later identified as Amy Porter, a nurse at the local VA hospital, was the first to reach him. "Don't move," she instructed calmly, grabbing the handles of his wheelchair to stabilize it. Her husband, Greg, a former Army medic with a pronounced limp, was right behind her. "Let's get you back to safety," Greg said, helping to pull the wheelchair back to the curb. The crowd that had gathered was anything but calm. Angry voices rose as several people confronted Simmons, who stood frozen, his face pale as he seemed to realize what he had done. Murphy was shouting into his radio, calling for backup. "We have a situation at the north entrance. Need assistance? Immediately." A young woman with dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail had captured the entire incident on her phone. Her name was Lisa Jacobs, though Rick wouldn't learn this until later. Without saying a word to anyone, she stepped away from the crowd, her fingers flying over her phone's screen. "Dad," she said into the phone, her voice low but urgent. "You need to get down here right now." A security guard just shoved a veteran in a wheelchair into traffic at the parade entrance. She paused, listening. "Yes, right now, it's bad." Rick sat on the sidewalk, surrounded by concerned citizens offering water and asking if he was hurt. Physically, he was fine. The taxi had stopped in time. But the humiliation burned worse than any physical injury. In the distance, sirens wailed. Murphy approached Rick, his face a mask of professional concern that couldn't quite hide his panic. "Sir, I want to apologize for my colleague's behavior. That was completely unacceptable. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Rick looked past the security supervisor to where Simmons stood, now being berated by his colleagues. The young guard wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. "I'm not injured," Rick said quietly, "but I want that man's name and his supervisor's contact information." Murphy nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. Again, I can't express how sorry." He was interrupted by the sound of tires squealing to a halt nearby. A black SUV with government plates had pulled up to the curb. The crowd parted as a tall man in a crisp military uniform stepped out. 4 military police officers exited the vehicle behind him. Rick immediately recognized the insignia. Major, General, the highest-ranking officer he had seen in person since his medical discharge. Exactly 6 minutes had passed since Simmons had pushed him into traffic. The crowd fell silent as Major General Howard Jacobs moved with purpose toward the scene. His presence commanded immediate respect. The 4 military police officers who accompanied him formed a protective semicircle behind him. Their faces were stern and professional. Rick Collins straightened his posture instinctively, years of military training kicking in despite his seated position. He recognized authority when he saw it. Lisa Jacobs, the young woman who had made the phone call, stepped forward. "Dad," she said quietly. The general nodded at his daughter before turning his attention to the situation at hand. His eyes scanned the scene quickly, taking in Rick in his wheelchair, the agitated crowd and the security guards who now stood at awkward attention. "Who's in charge here?" General Jacobs asked. His voice wasn't particularly loud, but it carried weight that made everyone listen. Murphy stepped forward, sweat visible on his forehead. "I am, sir. Paul Murphy, supervisor for Sentinel Security Services. Can someone tell me exactly what happened? The general asked, his eyes moving between Rick and Murphy. Before anyone could answer, Greg Porter pushed through the crowd. I saw the whole thing, sir. My wife and I were right behind this gentleman. He pointed to Rick. That security guard, over there, he continued, pointing at Simmons, shoved his wheelchair when he asked for the accessible entrance to be cleared, sent him right into traffic. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Amy Porter stepped forward and placed her hand on Rick's shoulder. It's a miracle he wasn't hit. That taxi driver deserves a medal for stopping in time. General Jacobs turned his full attention to Rick. And you are, sir? Staff Sergeant Rick Collins, sir. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Retired. The general's expression softened slightly. He extended his hand and Rick shook it firmly. Major General Howard Jacobs, I appreciate your service, Staff Sergeant. He looked at Rick's medals and nodded with understanding. Afghanistan? Yes, sir. 3rd tour. Jacobs nodded again, then turned back to Murphy. His expression hardened. I want to speak with the individual who put hands. The Veterans Day Parade was in full swing as Rick Collins, accompanied by General Jacobs, made their way to the VIP section. People turned to look as they passed. It wasn't every day that a 2-star general personally escorted someone through a public event. Diane walked alongside them, still visibly shaken by what had happened. Your medals, General Jacobs commented as they moved through the crowd. Purple Heart and Bronze Star with Valor. Impressive record, Staff Sergeant. Rick nodded modestly. Just did what anyone would do, sir. The general smiled slightly. We both know that's not true. Men like you are rare. They reached the VIP section where several high-ranking military officials and local politicians were already seated. A young aide rushed to arrange space for Rick's wheelchair in the front row. The general introduced Rick to several people, including the mayor and the base commander from the nearby military installation. Staff Sergeant Collins here is one of our finest, General Jacobs explained. Had a bit of trouble at the entrance today, but we sorted it out. The mayor, a woman named Betty Mason with a warm smile and firm handshake, greeted Rick with genuine respect. It's an honor to meet you, Staff Sergeant. We're grateful for your service. As they settled in to watch the parade, Rick noticed several people nearby discreetly using their phones. One man in a suit leaned over to his companion and whispered something while glancing in Rick's direction. The whispers spread through the VIP section like a gentle wave. I think word is getting around, Diane said quietly to Rick. About what happened? Rick shifted uncomfortably in his wheelchair. He had never sought attention for his service or his disability. The thought of becoming some kind of viral sensation made his stomach churn. General Jacobs must have noticed Rick's discomfort. He leaned in and spoke in a low voice. I understand this isn't the kind of attention you want, Collins. But sometimes, these things happen for a reason. What reason would that be, sir? Rick asked. Change, the general replied simply. Things don't change unless people see the problem. Before Rick could respond, the parade announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, introducing the first group of marchers. The high school marching band struck up a patriotic tune as they passed by, their uniforms crisp and movements precise. For the next hour, Rick tried to focus on enjoying the parade. Groups of veterans from different eras marched by, some in wheelchairs, like him, others walking proudly despite visible prosthetics or other signs of injury. Each group received enthusiastic applause from the crowd. During a brief lull in the parade, General Jacobs excused himself to take a phone call. When he returned, his expression was serious. That was the CEO of Sentinel Security Services, Himeno explained to Rick and Diane. Word travels fast when it comes to incidents like this. He wanted me to extend his personal apologies and inform you that Mr. Simmons has been terminated, effective immediately. Rick nodded, not sure how to feel about that news. On one hand, the security guard's actions had been inexcusable. On the other, Rick didn't want to be responsible for someone losing their job. The supervisor, Murphy, has also been suspended pending further investigation, the general continued. And the company is reviewing its training protocols regarding accessibility and treatment of veterans. Diane squeezed Rick's hand. Good. They should. There's more, the general added. The local news picked up the story. They've requested an interview with you, Staff Sergeant. I told them I'd pass along the request, but the decision is entirely yours. Rick frowned. I don't know, sir. I'm not really comfortable with that kind of attention. I understand, General, Jacobs replied. But consider this, your experience today isn't unique. Many veterans face similar treatment, though perhaps not as dramatic. Your voice could make a difference. As they spoke, Lisa Jacobs approached, carrying 3 bottles of water. She handed one to her father and offered the others to Rick and Diane. The video has over 50,000 views already, she informed them, showing her phone screen. And people are sharing it everywhere. Rick looked at the view counter on the video with disbelief. 50,000 people had seen his moment of helplessness and humiliation. The thought made him feel exposed and vulnerable. What are people saying? Diane asked, peering at the phone. They're outraged, Lisa replied. But mostly they're impressed by how quickly the military responded. She looked at her father with obvious pride. Dad's getting a lot of praise for stepping in. General Jacobs waved this off. I just happened to be nearby and received a call from my daughter. Any officer would have done the same. Not with 4 MPs and within 6 minutes. Lisa pointed out with a small smile. The parade continued, but Rick found it harder to focus on the spectacle. His mind kept returning to the incident, replaying it from different angles. The shock of being pushed, the terror of rolling into traffic, the humiliation of needing to be rescued, and now, the strange aftermath of becoming an unwitting internet sensation. During another break in the parade, a man in a business suit approached their section. He spoke briefly with one of the event coordinators, who then pointed toward Rick. The man nodded and walked over. Staff Sergeant Collins, my name is Ben Harris. I'm the Regional Director for Veterans Affairs. He offered his hand, which Rick shook. May I have a word? With the general's nod of approval, Harris pulled up a chair. I've been briefed about what happened at the entrance today, he began. Completely unacceptable. I wanted to personally apologize on behalf of the event organizing committee. Thank you, Rick replied simply. There's something else, Harris continued. We've been trying to put together a committee to review accessibility at veterans events nationwide. After today's incident, it's clear we need to accelerate those plans. Would you consider being part of that committee? Rick blinked in surprise. Me? I don't have any special expertise in accessibility issues. You have the most important expertise of all, Harris replied. Lived experience. Plus, after today, you have visibility. People will listen. Rick looked to Diane, who nodded encouragingly. Think about it, she said. You're always saying how frustrated you get with poor accessibility. Here's a chance to actually do something about it. Rick turned back to Harris. Can I think about it and let you know? Of course, Harris handed Rick a business card. Take all the time you need. As Harris walked away, Rick noticed General Jacobs watching him with a thoughtful expression. What? Rick asked. Sometimes life puts us in positions we didn't ask for, the general said. The question is what we do with those positions once we find ourselves in them. Before Rick could respond, a commotion near the entrance to the VIP section caught everyone's attention. A man was arguing loudly with security, trying to push his way through. That's him, the man shouted, pointing at Rick. That's the guy from the video. Rick recognized him as the taxi driver who had nearly hit him when his wheelchair rolled into traffic. The security guards were trying to keep him out of the VIP area, but the man was persistent. I just want to talk to him, the driver insisted. I need to know he's okay. General Jacobs nodded to one of his MPs, who spoke to the security guards. They reluctantly let the taxi driver through. The man rushed over, still looking shaken. Sir, I'm Joe Martinez. I was driving the taxi that almost... I just needed to make sure you were all right. I haven't been able to think about anything else. Rick reached out and shook the driver's hand. I'm fine, thanks to your quick reflexes. You stopped in time. That's what matters. Martinez looked relieved. When I saw that wheelchair roll into the street, my heart nearly stopped. I've been driving for 15 years. Never had anything like that happen. As Martinez spoke, more people began to gather around Rick. Some were veterans who had marched in the parade. Others were just ordinary citizens who had seen the video. All of them wanted to express their support or share their own stories of accessibility challenges. Rick found himself at the center of a growing crowd, all looking to him for something. Leadership, inspiration, validation. He wasn't sure, but he could feel the weight of their expectations settling on his shoulders. Diane leaned close and whispered, "Looks like you might not have a choice about being a spokesperson after all." Rick nodded slowly, beginning to understand what General Jacobs had meant. Sometimes life puts you in positions you didn't ask for. The real test is what you do next. 1 week after the incident, Rick sat in his living room staring at his laptop screen in disbelief. The video of him being pushed into traffic had been viewed over 2 million times. News outlets across the country had picked up the story. His phone hadn't stopped ringing with interview requests. "I still can't believe this," Rick said to Diane, who was bringing him a cup of coffee. All this attention over something that lasted less than a minute. Diane set the coffee down and squeezed his shoulder. "It wasn't just what happened to you. It was how quickly the general responded. People loved that part of the story." Rick nodded. The media had indeed latched onto the 6 minutes later angle. General Jacobs had become something of a hero on social media, praised for his swift action and no-nonsense approach to the situation. The image of him arriving with MPs in tow had become an internet meme, captioned with phrases like, "Mess with our vets, deal with our brass." Rick's phone buzzed with yet another call. He checked the screen and sighed. "It's that reporter from the national news again." "Are you going to talk to her?" Diane asked. Rick hesitated. He had avoided most interview requests so far, but this particular reporter had been persistent. She had promised to focus on the broader issues of accessibility and respect for disabled veterans, rather than just the dramatic moment caught on video. "Maybe," Rick said. "I need to think about it." The doorbell rang. Diane went to answer it while Rick continued scrolling through the countless messages and comments on social media. Most were supportive, expressing outrage at his treatment and admiration for his service. But there were also messages from other disabled veterans, sharing similar stories of discrimination and barriers they had faced. These were the messages that affected Rick the most. He had always considered his struggles with accessibility as personal challenges to overcome, not as part of a larger systemic problem. Now, he was beginning to see the bigger picture. Diane returned to the living room with Ben Harris, the VA, regional director who had approached Rick at the parade. Harris carried a folder tucked under his arm and looked both serious and excited. "Staff Sergeant Collins, thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Harris said, shaking Rick's hand. "Please call me Rick. I've been out of the service for 3 years now." Harris nodded and took a seat on the couch. "Rick, I've been following the response to your story closely. The public reaction has been overwhelming." "Tell me about it," Rick said with a small laugh. "I never wanted to be famous, especially not for something like this." "That's actually why I'm here," Harris said, opening his folder. "We have an opportunity to channel all this attention into something positive. Something that could help a lot of veterans like yourself." He handed Rick a document titled Accessibility Initiative for Veterans Events and Public Spaces. Rick scanned the first page, which outlined a comprehensive plan to review and improve accessibility at veterans events nationwide. "This is the committee you mentioned?" Rick asked. "Yes, but it's grown into something much bigger," Harris explained. "After your story went viral, we received calls from several major veterans organizations offering support. Even the White House has expressed interest." Rick raised his eyebrows in surprise. "The White House?" Harris nodded. "The President's Chief of Staff called personally. They're considering making this part of a broader initiative on veterans affairs." Diane, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "That's amazing. But what exactly would Rick's role be in all this?" "We'd like him to be the face of the initiative," Harris said. "His story has resonated with people in a way that statistics and policy papers never could. We need someone who can speak to the real-world impact of these issues. Rick frowned. I'm not a public speaker, and I'm definitely not a policy expert. You don't have to be, Harris assured him. We have experts for the technical aspects. What we need is someone authentic who can connect with the public and with other veterans, someone who can turn this moment of outrage into lasting change. Rick looked down at his wheelchair, thinking. 3 years ago, when he had returned home with his injuries, he had struggled to find purpose, the physical therapy, the adjustments, to civilian life, the constant barriers, both physical and social. All of it had left him feeling adrift. Now suddenly he was being offered a chance to make a difference. There's something else you should know, Harris added. Sentinel Security Services has reached out. They want to meet with you. Rick looked up sharply. The company that employed that guard? Why would I want to meet with them? They're making major changes to their training programs, Harris explained, and they're offering to fund part of this initiative as a way to make amends. Their CEO would like to discuss it with you personally. Before Rick could respond, his phone rang again. This time, it was General Jacobs. Rick hesitated, then answered, and put the call on speaker. Staff Sergeant Collins, the general's voice came through clearly. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, sir, Rick replied. Mr. Harris from the VA is here, discussing the accessibility initiative. Excellent. That's actually why I'm calling. I've been speaking with several members of Congress about this initiative. There's support for turning this into legislation. They're tentatively calling it the Collins Act. Rick was stunned. The what? The Collins Act, General Jacobs repeated. It would establish national standards for accessibility at all government-funded events and require enhanced training for security personnel regarding veterans and people with disabilities. Sir, I don't know what to say, Rick stammered. This is moving very fast. I understand it's a lot to take in, the general acknowledged. But timing is critical with these things. We need to act while people are still paying attention. Rick looked at Diane, who nodded encouragingly. Then he looked at Harris, who was watching him expectantly. He thought of all the messages he had received from other veterans, sharing their stories and thanking him for bringing attention to these issues. What exactly would I need to do? Rick asked finally. Harris leaned forward eagerly. Meet with key stakeholders, share your story, consult on the development of new guidelines, maybe testify before Congress if the legislation moves forward. And the meeting with Sentinel? Rick asked. That's up to you, Harris said. But I think it could be powerful. Show them, and everyone else, that this isn't about punishment or public shaming. It's about creating real, lasting change. Rick took a deep breath. 1 week ago, he had been just another disabled veteran trying to attend a parade. Now, he was being asked to become the face of a national movement. It was overwhelming, but also strangely inspiring. Okay, he said finally. I'll do it, but I want to do this right. I want to represent all the veterans who face these kinds of barriers, not just myself. That's exactly what we need, Harris said, smiling broadly. General Jacobs spoke up from the phone. Excellent decision, Collins. I knew we could count on you. My office will be in touch to coordinate our efforts. After they hung up with the general, Harris spent another hour discussing the details of the initiative with Rick and Diane. By the time he left, Rick had a calendar full of meetings and a head full of new possibilities. That evening, as Rick prepared for bed, Diane found him staring thoughtfully out the window. Penny for your thoughts? She asked, wrapping her arms around his shoulders from behind. I keep thinking about what the general said at the parade, Rick replied. About how life sometimes puts us in positions we didn't ask for, and the real test is what we do with those positions. Diane nodded. And what do you think you'll do with this position? Rick turned his wheelchair to face her. I think I'm going to try to make sure that no other veteran gets pushed aside, literally or figuratively, ever again. Diane smiled and kissed him gently. I'm proud of you. You're going to change things. We'll see, Rick said. First step is that meeting with Sentinel tomorrow. I'm still not sure what to say to them. Just be honest, Diane advised. Tell them exactly what it felt like to be treated that way. Make them understand why it matters. Rick nodded, knowing she was right. Tomorrow would be the first test of his new role as an advocate. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew he had to try. Too many people were counting on him now. 6 months had passed since the incident at the Veterans Day Parade. Rick Collins sat in the hallway outside a large conference room in Washington, D.C., adjusting his tie nervously. Today was the day the Collins Act would be signed into law. Diane sat beside him, looking elegant in a navy blue dress. She reached over and straightened his tie. Stop fidgeting. You look fine. Rick smiled at her. I'm not worried about how I look. I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of this. 6 months ago, I was just trying to attend a parade. Now I'm about to watch the president sign a law with my name on it. You earned this, Diane said firmly. You've worked harder than anyone these past months. She was right. Rick had thrown himself into the accessibility initiative with unexpected passion. What had begun as a reluctant acceptance of his new role had quickly evolved into a genuine calling. He had traveled across the country, meeting with veterans groups, speaking at conferences, and testifying before Congress. His quiet, straightforward manner of speaking had proven effective in cutting through political noise and focusing attention on the real issues. The door to the conference room opened, and Ben Harris poked his head out. They're ready for you, Rick. Rick took a deep breath and wheeled himself forward, Diane walking beside him. As they entered the room, he was struck by the number of people present. Government officials, representatives from veterans organizations, members of Congress, and of course the president, all waiting for him. General Jacobs, now a familiar face after months of working together, stepped forward to greet them. Staff Sergeant Collins, Mrs. Collins, this is your day. Rick shook the general's hand. None of this would have happened without you, sir. The general shook his head. I just made a phone call. You did the real work. They were directed to seats near the front of the room. As Rick positioned his wheelchair in place, he noticed someone unexpected in the crowd. Frank Simmons, the security guard who had pushed him into traffic. Simmons looked different now. His hair was neater, his posture straighter, and his expression more serious. He caught Rick's eye and gave a small, hesitant nod. The meeting with Sentinel Security Services 6 months ago had been tense, but productive. The CEO had offered a genuine apology and proposed a partnership. Sentinel would completely overhaul their training programs, with input from Rick and other veterans. They would create a new position, Director of Accessibility and Veterans Affairs, and commit to hiring disabled veterans throughout the company. Most surprisingly, they had offered to rehire Frank Simmons, pending Rick's approval. The young guard had written a heartfelt letter of apology, explaining that he had been overwhelmed and undertrained, but acknowledging that those were explanations, not excuses. Rick had agreed to the rehiring on one condition, that Simmons work directly on the new training program, sharing his experience as a cautionary tale. Now, seeing Simmons in attendance at this historic moment felt right somehow. The incident that had started everything had been about more than one person's mistake. It had revealed systemic problems that needed addressing. The president approached the podium, and the room fell silent. Today, I am proud to sign into law the Collins Accessibility for Veterans Act. This legislation represents a significant step forward in how our nation treats those who have served and sacrificed. As the president spoke about the details of the law, mandatory accessibility standards for public events, enhanced training requirements for security personnel, increased funding for accessibility improvements at veterans' facilities, Rick reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The president concluded his remarks and invited Rick to join him for the signing. As Rick wheeled himself to the table, he felt a swell of pride. The Collins Act would help thousands of veterans like himself navigate public spaces with dignity. After the ceremonial signing, with multiple pens that would be distributed as souvenirs, the president shook Rick's hand. You've turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change, Staff Sergeant Collins. That's the best of America right there. The formal ceremony was followed by a reception. Rick found himself surrounded by well-wishers, many of whom had worked alongside him to make the legislation a reality. Among them was Joe Martinez, the taxi driver who had nearly hit Rick that day. Martinez had become an unexpected ally, speaking at public events about the importance of accessibility from a civilian perspective. "Never thought I'd be in the White House," Martinez said, looking around in wonder. "My kids won't believe this." Rick laughed. "I know the feeling." Across the room, Rick spotted Lisa Jacobs deep in conversation with a group of young veterans. She had graduated from college and joined her father's staff as a civilian aide, focusing specifically on veterans' issues. Her video of the incident had been just the beginning of her advocacy work. Amy and Greg Porter were there too, having become good friends with Rick and Diane over the months. Amy had used her position at the VA hospital to implement accessibility improvements immediately, not waiting for the legislation to pass. As Rick made his way through the crowd, he was stopped by a tall man in an expensive suit, the CEO of Sentinel Security Services. "Staff Sergeant Collins," the CEO said, extending his hand. "Congratulations on this achievement." "Thank you," Rick replied. "How's the new training program coming along?" "Very well. Actually, Mr. Simmons has been instrumental in its development. He's become quite passionate about the work." The CEO nodded toward Simmons, who was standing nearby. Rick wheeled himself over to the young man who had inadvertently changed his life. "Mr. Collins," Simmons said formally, "I want to thank you again for giving me a second chance. Not many people would have done that." Rick studied him for a moment. "Everyone deserves a second chance. The important thing is what you do with it." "I'm trying to make the most of mine," Simmons assured him. "The new training program is reaching thousands of security personnel. We're making real changes in how our staff handle accessibility issues." Rick nodded, satisfied. This was what real accountability looked like. Not just punishment, but transformation. General Jacobs joined them, accompanied by several members of Congress. "Collins, these legislators are already talking about expanding the scope of the act for next year. They'd like your input." The conversation shifted to policy details and future plans. Rick found himself speaking with confidence about accessibility standards and implementation strategies, topics he had known nothing about 6 months ago. Later, as the reception was winding down, Rick and Diane found a quiet corner for a moment. "Alone. How does it feel?" Diane asked. "Seeing your name on a law that will help so many people?" Rick thought about it. "Surreal, but good. Really good." "You know what I'm most proud of?" Diane said. "It's not the law itself, though that's incredible. It's how you handled everything. You never became bitter. You never made it just about you. You made it about all veterans." Rick squeezed her hand. "I had good people around me. You, the General, Harris, everyone who stepped up that day and in the months after." A staff member approached to let them know the presidential motorcade was preparing to leave. As they made their way out, Rick passed a large mirror in the hallway and caught a glimpse of himself, dressed in a suit in his wheelchair, in the White House. It was not a life he had imagined for himself, certainly not on that Veterans Day, 6 months ago. Outside, as they waited for their car, General Jacobs approached one last time. "You know, Collins, when I arrived at that parade entrance 6 minutes after my daughter called, I had no idea we'd end up here." Rick smiled. "Life puts us in positions we don't ask for. The real test is what we do with those positions once we find ourselves in them." The general laughed, using my own words against me. "Well played, Staff Sergeant." As their car arrived, Rick looked back at the White House. The incident that had started as a moment of humiliation had transformed into something powerful and positive. One security guard's thoughtless action had sparked a movement. One veteran's experience had led to changes that would benefit thousands. Rick Collins had never asked to be pushed into traffic. He had never asked to become the face of a movement or to have his name on a law. But now that he found himself in this position, he was determined to make the most of it, not just for himself, but for every veteran who had ever faced similar barriers. Sometimes he reflected as their car pulled away. The most important journeys begin with a push in an unexpected direction.